Hello and welcome to the 2020 Community Stories Film Festival Virtual Edition. This is the first time we've done this virtually and we're really excited about that. I hope that you enjoy the screening of Maryland Mystery Lady and thank you for joining us for the Q&A. My name's Chris Higgins. I'm a volunteer and an alum of the Docs in Progress Fellowship Program, and I'll be facilitating the discussion. We'll take audience questions during the second half of our conversations, so please submit your questions to our panelists in the comments box. So now I'd like to introduce, or ask our panelists actually to introduce themselves and tell us about their role in the film. And I'm going to start with Amy.
Hi. I'm Amy. I'm actually also a Docs in Progress fellow, or former fellow. I think I was class of 2014. So a while ago. Maybe later. Anyway, I directed and shot most of and edited the film for Maryland Public Television.
Fantastic. And now Dana, welcome.
Oh, you're muted.
Yes, Dana, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry about
that. Welcome.
My name is Dana Coleman, and I was the bioarchaeologist on the project. So I looked at all of the human skeletal remains that came out of the site. I think there were well over 100 burial features, but at the end of the day, I think there were about 75 skeletons that we looked at.
Fantastic. And Julie, please introduce yourself to us.
Hi, I'm Julia Shablitsky, and I am the Maryland Department of Transportation Chief Archaeologist, and I directed the excavation of over 70 individuals, including going and shepherding our mystery lady through the process of determining who she was. So that was my role.
Great. Thank you. And we're hoping that Reverend Jerome Fowler can join us later on. When he does, we'll bring him into the conversation. So I want to start with you, Amy, and if you can tell us about how this film came about and how you initially heard about these 70 plus graves and the work that Julie was doing.
Yeah, sure. So there was actually another producer at MPT who had worked with Julie on some projects before, and came into a content production meeting one day and said, hey, there's this thing with a metal coffin or something. I don't know. We were down there the other day, and I think maybe you could follow up with this because I don't think it was quite in the purview of the stuff that he does normally. And I'm sort of a jack of all trades at my job. Kind of like general, like most of what I do winds up being pretty general. It's not like subject specific. So yeah, then I got in touch with Julian and was sort of off to the races after that. I feel like the first shoot date was actually the morgue date. So it was like a little trial by fire in the beginning.
And so I believe in the film, it states that this process started in 2017. Is that correct?
I think it was. Julie, you know better than me.
It seems like a really long time ago, but yeah, it was a couple of years ago where we started it. And it was during such a terrible time of the year. We started in the late fall. And then it bled over until winter, till the point where when we were excavating, we couldn't physically get the bone out of the ground. So we had to just kind of stop where we were at and then return in the spring. And it was a very, very wet spring. That made it difficult.
So, Julie, how often does this kind of a thing happen? I believe you mentioned in the film that when a cemetery is relocated, it's not uncommon for remains to be left behind. But have you dealt with any other situations that were this extensive?
Well, with the Highway Administration, every DOT across the nation, each state has one. And we do the most archaeological research and architectural history work in the state because we move so much earth and ground. And a lot of times the roads that we have are simply get widened as time goes along. And what ends up happening is sometimes, those cemeteries, those settlements are all along these roadways. And so when we start to widen, we do get into sometimes cemeteries. But it's very, very rare that we have to do a full cemetery relocation. Sometimes we might get close where we might be infecting a couple graves and we just work with the church to see what we should do. But it's very, very rare nowadays because we have all sorts of archaeology tools to locate cemeteries, whether it's ground penetrating radar, old maps, and a lot of historical research. So we try to, in the planning stage of everything, avoid the situation. This scene, in this place, what was interesting is that the site was, which may not have been completely clear in the film, but in around 1970, we did have the property, but we ended up acquiring it after it was supposedly the cemetery was moved in around 1970, 71. In fact, the church is the one who sold the property and wanted to relocate the human remains. But when they did that, the person that they hired just didn't get everybody. And we kind of know that as archaeologists that you just never ever get everybody. Someone's left behind, or people are left behind, parts are left behind. So they never get everybody unless you hire an archaeologist. So in this sort of situation, when we went back and we were in the process of selling the property, and we ended up finding out that this was an old cemetery, unfortunately, people were left behind, and we were there then to help the church find out where they wanted us to move the rest of the remains.
And Dana, tell us about the stage at which you were brought in and exactly what your role was. We saw a little bit of that in the film, but it was really fascinating to me, the amount of work that I know when I think of archaeology, it is a lot of what we saw in the first half of the film of being out in the field and digging through the dirt. But you're doing a lot of that behind the scenes stuff. So can you talk to us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the mystery lady actually had gone to the anatomy board. So my involvement with her was actually pretty minimal. With the remainder of the skeletons that were recovered from the site, they all came into the lab. Some were removed in pedestals or blocks of soil just because the bone was so friable. It was just a better way of getting it out of the ground. So there was significant excavation and cleaning that had to take place in the laboratory. I think another thing to keep in mind is that when we're cleaning the remains, we also don't know if there's personal effects that are associated with them that could be in the mud, like beads from jewelry or, hair combs, things along those lines, dental restorations. So a big part of the process is cleaning the remains, then drying the remains, and then we do a full skeletal analysis. I mean, the work that we attempt to do on a fragmented skeleton is the exact same thing that we try to figure out on a complete skeleton. So we want basic demographic information, age and sex and ancestry, stature. If we can determine it, we want to look for evidence of any sort of cultural modification to the skeleton, any disease or pathology that either a person had when they died or maybe something that they had ante-mortem and had recovered from. So yeah, it's a lot of work. And then of course added to that would be things like detailed photography, X-ray, taking samples for DNA or stable isotope analysis. So it takes some time, that's for sure.
Yeah, it certainly sounds laborious. Since you're at a university, are students involved with this work?
Yes, I do involve students, and it's a great learning opportunity for them to work with real human remains that come from real archaeological sites. And some of them have been involved in varying steps of the process, everything from receiving the remains from the funeral home, they arrived to school in a hearse, to being part of the processional, to helping me clean and photograph them. So yes, they do have student involvement. We also have involvement with some of our other departments in the sense that if we needed something, it wasn't the case on this one, but if we needed something 3D scanned, we could do that. Or if we needed them to use, chemical means to assess something that we found on a skeleton, they could help us do that as well.
Very cool. Amy, if you can talk about the importance of this film, why was it important for you to tell this story?
Sure. I mean, I think, we have an ongoing relationship with State Highway, because Maryland Public TV, although we're a PBS affiliate, we're also a state agency. So we tend to work pretty closely with a lot of other state agencies. I will say that, like, for me, the most interesting and rewarding projects that I usually get to work on are things that, at least in some way, touch on like social issues. And so the connection for this specific project to those larger themes about like who's being forgotten about, who, like, what is the societal significance of these things, for me that like becomes the driving interesting force in the narrative. And then of course, like, getting to know Reverend Fowler was really nice. Being able to like work pretty closely with the church was important. Make sure that we're all kind of on the same page.
And for Julie, you kind of touched on this earlier, but how often, with the mystery lady in particular, how often do you come upon cases like that of remains that were just as pristine as hers were?
You don't, and I doubt I'll ever will again. And I think that's the thing, is that as an archaeologist in Maryland and their type of soils, is that when you have a skeleton that is in a wooden box and is placed in the ground, it's very rare to see the fully articulated skeleton there, a couple hundred years later. It just doesn't happen. Even in that same cemetery we were excavating, we'd have people that were buried the same time, or maybe even several years later than our mystery lady. And they were down to just the long bones and maybe some teeth, and their cranium had been like damaged. So we only have a partial skeleton of a lot of these people who were buried about the same time. But being in that airtight metal burial vault and just kind of in a way kind of vacuum packed in that case, just completely without oxygen, without any moisture, it preserved her perfectly.
Some
eyelashes, I remember.
Yeah, her eyebrows, her eyelashes. And the interesting thing is that when we crack that open, all of a sudden it's like when the air kind of rushed in, you could see all of a sudden her kind of full black pearls began to kind of like just almost in a sense crumble, and the earrings began to kind of crumble off of her. And so it's like as soon as that modern 21st air hit her, she began to decompose again.
Yeah, there was a reference to that in the film. How urgent then was the need to move her into an environment where you could control that decomposition?
Well, that's the thing, is that we didn't know what we're going to get when we opened that casket up. So I had the archaeologist standing by. I had Dana on speed dial. I had an undertaker, because I didn't know if I was going to have a perfectly preserved human body, whoever it was, because we didn't know who she was. There was no headstone, and we didn't know whether he or she. I had the archaeologist, the undertaker, so I had everybody, because I just didn't know if I was going to have, a skeleton, if I was going to have perfectly preserved or something in between. So I remember I was calling up Dana and telling her what's going on. She's like, at first I was gonna take the whole thing and put it on a flatbed truck and take it to her lab. But now I'm glad that I didn't, because I don't think she was going to be able to handle that, because it was in such good shape. So we had Gash's funeral home was there, and we had a hearse there, and we simply rolled her, put her on a backboard, as you saw in the film, and was able to take her out of this, again, it was a very muddy, mucky day. But the team took her out and put her in there, and immediately took her right to the anatomy board. But even then, I didn't know where to take her. I was like panicking, and within a couple hours, I had to figure out, where do I put her? Who's going to take her? Because the funeral home can only take her for a little while. But so that's why the anatomy board kind of came to the rescue, because they're used to dealing with unclaimed bodies, like dozens a day. So they were able to help us out.
So how much time lapsed between when you initially found that metal vault that the coffin was in and when you were able to actually open up and find the mystery lady?
Well, it was during that spring, it was pouring out. So we had to kind of time when we could get in there between storms. And so what ended up happening, it was probably, a couple of days, because that allowed me to really get in there and I kind of assess the situation and get everything kind of our ducks in a row before we out of there. So it was just a couple of.
Okay. We just got a question in about what were you thinking in that moment? You were clearly quite emotional. Do you remember what was going through your head at that time?
Yeah, so at the time, we had opened the casket, and well, first when we first kind of just lifted it up, I didn't know if there was going to be anything in there. I didn't know there was going to be a casket. So when it came that all of a sudden it opened up, the first thing I saw was this spray of flowers, and it was dried. I mean, everybody's had a bouquet of flowers, and they end up drying out, and that's basically what it looked like. So all of a sudden, as soon as the vault was open, and I saw that casket with the flowers on top, it's like this rush of emotion and just kind of amazement and just I can't even explain. I can't even put it in words, but it was this feeling of just all these emotions coming over me that this was real. There was something there. She was loved. Whoever put this in there took care with her. And one thing that wasn't shown in the film was that exact casket spray was analyzed. And so we were able to take the seeds of the flowers in there. And when we reburied her, we reconstructed that. We had a florist reconstruct the exact same casket spray that she was buried with. So that's why when you look at it in the film, it might not look like your traditional lilies and roses, but it was something that was from the 1930s.
That's incredible. So, in watching it, and maybe it's because of the current pandemic and the fact that we're all wearing masks, but, I was thinking as they were cutting into the vault and opening the casket, are there health concerns there? You guys weren't wearing masks or anything. Is there any concern about anything coming out of that grave that could be dangerous?
I mean, there could be, but I just in that sort of situation, we didn't have any concern about that time. I mean, we didn't have concern. We were suited up in those suits, and we did have masks on. And it was because we were concerned with whatever could be in there. But in most situations that I've worked with, you just simply anticipate that there could be some sort of airborne contaminants, and you deal with that. But it's also the smell of just decomposition is very, very strong, and that's one thing that carried with her that you just don't get from the film. You don't get the smells and the feeling of the sloshing, the wet, and the humidity in the air. But that's what we're experiencing in a big way. So we're down there in this hole. We have the descendant community up above watching us. And we're having this really emotional, human, almost a taboo experience here by, awakening this woman.
I'm going to sort of combine a couple of the questions we have here from our viewers. Someone had asked both for Julie and Dana about the challenges or if there were any challenges for you in working with a film crew and having a film crew there as you're doing your work. And, on the flip side, Amy, what are some of the challenges that were present for you with this subject matter?
You guys want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Hey, you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I'm in this particular case, I was in the lab. So I can't say that I had many challenges. I know it can be a little bit more difficult when you're actually in the field and there's cameras and so forth around. But I think in this case, it was just Amy, unless I'm wrong. I really didn't have much of a role in the field. I did go out to the field, I think 2 or 3 times. But for me in the laboratory, it wasn't an issue. It wasn't an inconvenience at all. I don't know about the field, Julie.
Well, the thing that I was concerned about was that if it was okay to film these human remains at all, whether it was in the lab or whether it was in the field, because we didn't know who the person was. We didn't know who the descendants were at the time. until later on. And so the thought was that we had to have someone speak for her. And that's where Reverend Fowler came in and the descendant community, because I can't speak for them. I'm not the descendant community. So it was important that we had Reverend Fowler and everyone else being able to make decisions about, can we have them filmed? Is it okay if we do this? Can we take her to the anatomy board? Because when he was there, we stood around the back of that casket. Before we closed the door and she went to the anatomy board, he said, I remember this, she's one of ours, and we did a prayer around her. So he was taking care of her. And so there is always that concern of human remains, especially working with Native people, because it is, you don't, whether it's filming, whether it's photographs, or even in sometimes academic settings, you can't show skeletal remains because it's a dishonor, and it's again it's frowned upon with certain communities. But each community is different. Sometimes each descendant family is different. So you just look to them to direct you on what you can film, what you can show. And even before we let that out, Amy can probably speak to this too, is that we did a lot of kind of quality control, making sure it was going to be sensitive and respectful.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like on my end, a lot of those like nuances we sort of like work through in the edit, and like bouncing footage back and forth, and kind of like then looking at what I had and saying, okay, well, I can't use this, but like, in the moment, like I had, obviously pretty unrestricted access. I think like as far as filming and difficulty on my end, it's like, the first day I was like, yeah, we were in the anatomy board, and then the second day I was in the forensics lab. And like, I think for me, like one of the things that I like about doing this kind of work is that you do get to be on the front lines of a lot of like pretty wild situations and environments where you wouldn't normally have access. But there have definitely been like a few times in my career where I've been like, okay, you wanted to do this, here we are, like this is what we're doing today, But I was definitely nervous that day when we went into the anatomy board. I was like, my heart was beating like a jackrabbit when we went into the room with her,
Yeah, well, it's like, you get in there and it's like it's basically you go subterranean. It's got stainless steel. It's almost got the lights that are swinging back and forth, and walking down this hallway, and there's these like rooms, and so yeah, it's it's a little disturbing.
Yeah, they're like these rooms, and then remember he was like trying to show us some of the teaching spaces where they had like,
and there's all sorts of
cadavers laid out for students and stuff, and I was like, I'm good. I don't.
It's like an underground science lab, and it's also a place where it's this interesting place where science and so much respect and reverence for the dead all join together, and it's kind of an interesting space.
Both Julie, both you and Dana talk a bit in the film about the importance of this work and learning from the past. And one of our questions here asks about why it was that this person in particular was buried in the way that she was. And I think that speaks to eventually the identity that we that you discover as to who this woman was. Why was it so important, and this is for all three of you, why was it so important to determine who this person was?
Well, I can tell you that the interesting thing that we found out is, again, we didn't know who was in it. We were all speculating, oh, it's probably some really well-known man who had some sort of like, position in the church, or perhaps it was the local, authority figure, so-and-so. And so we had all these ideas of who this like person was, because it was the only one of those 70 people that we relocated that had this sort of like very fancy burial. So here it ended up turning out that Elizabeth James Williams, Lizzie, is, a lot of times how she was called. So Lizzie worked for the Pullman car company, cleaning cars. So the sleeper cars, the trains. So she was a cleaner, and I'm thinking that she was probably with the union at that time, and that when she passed, probably while she was employed by them, they may have actually paid for her funeral, because at the time, it appears that she was estranged from her husband, and her daughter had preceded her in death, and she was laid next to her, I'm sure. So I think that the way that she was able to afford it wasn't necessarily what she was doing, but that she was probably part of the union of the Coleman Car Company, and they may have, covered the bill of that burial, and that's why she was buried like that.
Yeah, and Dana, you spoke a bit in the film about the importance of learning these things. Can you talk more about why that is important to learn from the past and what we can get out of it and utilize today?
Yeah, sure. So in archaeology in the past, oftentimes the skeletons up until maybe like the 1930s or so, they were mentioned sort of in passing, but when we think about what stories the skeleton actually has to say, it's a skeletal biography. And so when we put all of these individual biographies together, we look at the larger population, we can get an idea on morbidity, on mortality. We can look at the spread of not just material artifacts like coffins or so forth, but we can also look at other grave associations. I think it's interesting to note that her Clark coffin, Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they were not making those regionally, so that would have been likely imported. I could be wrong. Correct me if that's the case. But all of this ties into a much bigger picture about who were they. And I think one of the interesting things that Julie had brought up before is initially when we were in the field, or I should say when they were in the field, oh, who is it? Could it be a local politician? Could it be the commander of the church? Could it be? And it turns out to be a woman in the 1930s, which I think is, it's worth its weight in gold, just that piece right there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, it looks like that Reverend Fowler is having some technical issues, and so he hasn't been able to join us yet. And since he's not with us, Amy, I'm going to direct this towards you. There was a question about the African American community. I was wondering what the congregation's response was. Did Reverend Fowler talk with you, or did you talk with any of the congregants about both discovering that there were still these 70 graves, but also the mystery woman herself?
Yeah, I mean, the day that sort of towards the end, there's footage from one of their Sunday services. And the day that I went in to film, they were pretty close to figuring everything out, but it hadn't come through yet. We hadn't really solidified things. But I think he had been keeping everyone posted, not necessarily on a weekly basis, but just had been updating the congregation. And everybody was just like very welcoming, very like wanted to tell me about how their families had a connection to the site. And oh, my relative had been buried there. And like, I'm so glad that you came. And so I think that folks seemed to me to be, really glad that people were trying to help work through this process. And actually, like earlier when you were asking sort of like what the importance of figuring out this woman's identity was, I mean, to me, like, and I think I remember talking about you both with this at the time, it was just like, I mean, closure, right? And so that seemed to be kind of the biggest takeaway from folks that I talked to in the church.
Yeah, and we just had so much energy put into that. So just trying to figure out who she was and to not be able to do it would have been really disappointing.
And here we have the man himself, Reverend Fowler.
Good evening, everyone.
Thank you for being able to join us. We appreciate it. We were just talking about your congregation. Could you speak to us about the response that they've had to the Mystery Lady?
This has been quite an exciting adventure. And I'm thankful for Dr. Shablitsky, who called me one day about 3 years ago and was looking for the Columbia Cemetery, if I remember correctly. And I told her I didn't know anything about the Columbia Cemetery. And she insisted on coming down from Baltimore and meeting with us at the church office, meeting with me and my staff, and getting a better idea. So she came down, and we finally realized we were talking about Simon Hill Cemetery, which the church purchased in 1885. I think it was for $50. Was that right, Julie?
Sounds about right, yeah.
Yes. And they were using that cemetery. I grew up in St. Paul Church. I grew up in the church. I'm a member of the founding family. But I did not remember the name Simon Hill. I never remembered going to the cemetery. The Plummer family, which was my family, my mother's family, did their burials at Harmony Cemetery in Northeast Washington, D.C. And so none of our family members are found to be buried there, our direct members. But we had, I believe, over 100 burials at Simon Hill. And as we started doing our research, we found out that other churches, other Black churches in the community in Prince George's County, did not own cemeteries. And if they needed a burial spot, they would contact us and ask for a plot, and it would be given to them to bury their members. And the mystery lady, as well as her daughter, were both buried at Simon Hill. Her daughter died in 1932, and the mother, the mystery lady, died in September 1938. And so they were both buried there. And it wasn't until we started looking at our records and recognizing names that we realized who it was.
And so, both Amy or Reverend Fowler, have you been in touch with the family in California?
Yes.
What has their reaction been to all of this?
They were quite excited. My cousin, Violetta Sharps Jones, did a thing on Ancestry.com. And so she was able to first pull up a possible relative of the mystery lady who lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado. We talked with him, but he, of course, did not know her. And the problem was he did not know who his father was. And we believed the family connection was on the father's side. But in further examination, Violetta found the family, two nieces and a nephew in Southern California. And she was able to contact those nieces and talk with them. They were quite excited. And when they found out what we were calling for, and I had a chance to talk with them as well, they were quite excited. And they had already submitted their DNA to Ancestry.com. So it was just a matter of them contacting and getting the process started. And they were delighted. We were delighted. This was their great aunt. The mystery lady is their great aunt. And that's when we found out who she was. And in further study, we found out we were able to determine, because Violetta had found a death notice in one of the local newspapers. And so we were able to get that. And then when we got the lady and we went to the anatomy board to examine her, we pulled when they started removing the clothing, they found under her skirt newspaper, which was dated September 1938, which confirmed that we had the right person. And so it's been quite an exciting adventure. And of course, this pandemic 19 has slowed up our process in getting her grave marked with a marker, and a marker for the other 40, what was it, 49 partial that we pulled up. So we are looking forward to getting that done and getting that straightened out before the end of the year.
That's fantastic. And Amy, as a filmmaker, did you have any desire to go out to California? I don't know if it was in your budget at all, but to get the family members on film?
I like how we're all laughing at the idea that I would have a budget for that. No. I mean, like, it would have been great. And it's funny because
Chicago,
I think
in California, I have no desire at this time.
I mean, I think like now it might be easier to do a Zoom interview than it might have been. You know, I think that's more the norm now. So who knows? Maybe that's in the future cards.
Yes, it may be. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and speaking about, you know, that, tell me a little bit about the filmmaking process. Was there a longer cut? It looks like the film was initially 4 separate episodes that were on Maryland Public Television.
Yeah, so the work that I do is digital studios work, so it's always web and social media distributed. So we try to keep it pretty short. And occasionally there will be like a series like this where there will be multiple segments. So that's why we kind of broke it out the way we did. There is not a longer cut, but I'm sure there will be a postscript at some point. But yeah, no, it was designed to be a couple different shorter segments.
Okay. Yeah, I know I would definitely love to hear from the family out there and their reaction to it.
When you speak of the Higgins, there is some families still in New Jersey where they originated from. And we were disappointed that none of them were willing to come down for that. And so I'm hopeful that my cousin still has their information and that we can get in touch with them and talk with them and let them know. They have shown really no interest in the program or what we did or how we did it, but the sisters in Southern California wanted to come, but they were unable at a short notice.
That's too bad. That's too bad. So we've got just a few more minutes here before we wrap up. And I'd like to go around real quick and hear from each of you, starting with Amy. What do you want people to ultimately get out of watching this film?
I mean, I think I'm probably going to steal the answer that I'm guessing Julie might have, which is just that this is not uncommon. I mean, like, I think that what we all experienced was uncommon in this specific burial, but like the idea that there are just tons of Black cemeteries around the country and like specifically in the South that, you know, in one way or another are not being recognized as such right now is like, it's a pretty big phenomenon. I think bigger than I realized when I started working on this project.
And Dana, what would you want people to get out of the film?
I think my takeaway is kind of Julie specific in the sense that whenever I work with her on projects, she's always thinking outside the box. And so I think this is a perfect example of taking a cemetery, which has to be relocated, which is not uncommon, but it's not all that common. I mean, we do handle, probably I handle a number of them a year. But to take it to the next level and think about how we can use DNA in sort of a reverse way to come up with an identity and how we can go to the anatomy board and, take DEXA scans, and how Julie could even arrange a place to keep her. I think it's that sort of spinning plates on your fingers that at the time it just seems so chaotic, but I think it's those really important decisions that are made early on that predict the overall success of a project.
I think we just lost Reverend Fowler to technology issues. So, Julie, I'm going to give the last word to you here. You said at the end of the film that if you can't respect the dead, how can you respect the living? What did you mean by that? If you can elaborate a little bit more. And again, what do you want folks to get out of seeing this film?
I think the important thing, and I think that we're seeing it in many of our communities, especially in the East Coast, is that there is an awakening happening in our society. And it's difficult, it's painful, but it has to happen. And in a way, it goes back to the cemeteries and the way that African American communities were treated, how it goes back to enslavement, and it goes back to society today. So in a way, these cemeteries are a way for us to heal. It's a way for us to have kind of a non-monetary reparation to what's happening out there in our society. And it's about time. And I mean, right now we're in the middle of trying to avoid a cemetery, an African American cemetery in Maryland here with the State Highway Administration. It's like, how do we go ahead and avoid this? Because we do have the sins of our forefathers to go ahead and reconcile. And I think that perhaps one way we can do this is, one cemetery at a time, and to make sure that when we do these, that people like the state government are not, and white people are not necessarily making decisions, but the African American community, the people who are represented. So there are a lot of times archaeologists in general do try to drive and to make these decisions, and they're not necessarily the best person or the best place to take that direction. So I see this as these cemeteries as a way for us to begin to heal. And again, you're right. I mean, like I said before, if you can't respect the dead, how can you ever respect the living? And going back and in a sense, remembering these people and giving them back their identity with what Dana does, and reconstructing that to have them in a way be remembered and us to rededicate is what we need to do and continue to do, and to do it better each time we do.
And Reverend Fowler, I'm going to give you the last word, actually. What do you want audiences to take away from watching the film?
Well, I want the audience to get a clearer understanding or passion for what is happening. When we bury our loved ones, we bury them in a sacred place where they can be remembered. We put markers and tombstones on their graves so that they can be recognized. And when we have to move those graves because the cemetery has been sold and for a different purpose, we must be careful to make sure that we get all that's in that grave out of the grave so that it can be kept together. I'm working right now with the people that work under Governor Larry Hogan here in Maryland, and Governor Ralph, the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam. One of our cemeteries in Washington, D.C., a black cemetery, was sold in the 1960s. And the graves were removed and taken. They bought a large plot of land in Prince George's County in a community called Landover. And they bought a larger cemetery, larger ground. But they did not allow the tombstones that family members had placed on their loved ones' graves. Just
And I'm afraid we may have lost
Oh, no.
Fowler. That was such an interesting comment he was making there. So hopefully he can jump back on. But actually, we need to wrap up here. So I'm going to thank you all very much, both for your work and the film, but also for joining us this evening. And I want to thank our viewers for joining us, for watching the film, and for being part of the Q&A. The recording of the Q&A will be available on the Docs in Progress YouTube channel this evening. And Community Stories is going to run through tomorrow as well. We've got 2 more screenings. So please be sure to check those out and reserve your free ticket. And Docs in Progress has not asked me to say this, but I am going to ask that if you appreciated this film festival, that please consider supporting Docs in Progress by making a donation. It is a nonprofit organization that provides a bunch of wonderful services to independent filmmakers, as well as the community at large. So thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to our viewers for joining us. And have a good evening.